Imagine you're a sailor in 1716. You've just spent 6 months at sea working 18-hour days for pennies. Your captain beats you for small mistakes. You eat moldy biscuits and drink water so foul it makes you sick. And when you finally reach port, you discover your wages have been cut because the ship's owner decided he needed a new carriage. Now imagine there's a place where things work differently, a place where captains are elected by vote, where every crew member gets an equal share of the profits, where if you lose a leg in battle, you receive compensation equivalent to 2 years of a normal sailor's wages, where former slaves can become captains, and where you have a say in every major decision. That place existed. It was called Nassau, in the Bahamas, and between 1715 and 1718, it became home to the most unusual democratic experiment of the 18th century, the Pirate Republic. This wasn't just a gang of thieves. It was a self-governing society of over 1,000 people who created their own laws, elected their own leaders, and built an economy that rivaled legitimate colonial trade. They had written constitutions more progressive than most European governments. They practiced a form of democracy that wouldn't become common for another 100 years. In this video, you'll discover how this republic actually worked, how pirates elected their captains and could vote them out, what their written codes said about everything from combat pay to musical performances, how they turned Nassau into a functioning port city, and why hundreds of men chose this dangerous life over legitimate work. We'll explore the daily reality of life in the Republic, not just the romantic myths. The governance structures, the economy, the social hierarchies, and the diversity of people who ended up under the black flag. To understand how all this came to be, we need to go back to 1713, to the end of a war that left thousands of men desperate, unemployed, and angry. The War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713, and almost overnight, the bottom fell out of the maritime labor market. During the war, European powers had employed thousands of privateers, essentially legal pirates with government permission to attack enemy ships. These men had spent years getting rich from captured vessels, operating under official letters of marque that made them heroes rather than criminals. But when peace came, those letters were revoked. Suddenly, 10,000 experienced sailors and fighters found themselves without work, without income, and without the adrenaline rush they'd grown accustomed to. The merchant navy couldn't absorb them all, and even if it could, the pay was terrible compared to what they'd earned as privateers. At the same time, conditions aboard legitimate merchant and naval vessels were getting worse. Ship owners, eager to maximize profits in peacetime, cut costs by reducing crew sizes, lowering wages, and skimping on food. Discipline became harsher. Captains, who held absolute power aboard their ships, could flog sailors for the smallest infractions. There was no appeal, no protection, no recourse. For a man who'd spent the war years as a privateer, earning equal shares with his crewmates and voting on major decisions, this return to authoritarian merchant service was intolerable. Many simply refused. They drifted to port cities, taking odd jobs, drinking away what little money they had, and growing increasingly desperate. That's when Nassau entered the picture. The island of New Providence in the Bahamas had a perfect natural harbor, but it had been largely abandoned during the war. The Spanish had raided it multiple times, burning the small settlement, and most legitimate colonists had fled. By 1713, Nassau was essentially empty, just a few scattered residents and the ruins of an old fort. But it had everything outlaws needed. The harbor was deep enough for large ships, but protected by sandbars that only experienced pilots could navigate, making it nearly impossible for naval vessels to mount a surprise attack. It was centrally located in the Caribbean shipping lanes, perfect for intercepting merchant traffic. And crucially, it had no functioning government, no laws, no authority, just empty beaches and abandoned buildings. The first pirates arrived in 1714. Then more came, and more. By 1715, over 700 men had settled in Nassau, and they'd begun calling it the Republic of Pirates. By 1716, that number exceeded 1,000. They weren't just visiting between raids, they were living there, building structures, establishing businesses, creating a society. And that society needed rules. Without some form of governance, 1,000 armed, violent men would simply tear themselves apart. So the pirates did something remarkable. They created a democracy. The foundation of pirate governance was the ship's articles, written codes that every crew member signed before sailing. These weren't vague guidelines. They were detailed legal documents that spelled out rights, responsibilities, and consequences, and they were surprisingly sophisticated. A typical pirate code from this period might run several pages. It covered everything you can imagine and quite a bit you probably can't. Let's look at some real examples from preserved pirate articles. First, and most importantly, democratic decision-making. Article 1 of most pirate codes stated that every crew member had an equal vote in major decisions. This included where to sail, which ships to attack, how to divide plunder, and whether to accept new members. The captain commanded during battle, but in all other matters, the crew voted. This was revolutionary. On a legitimate merchant or naval vessel, the captain's word was absolute law. He could order floggings, withhold rations, or throw men in irons on a whim. But on a pirate ship, the captain served at the pleasure of the crew. If the men lost confidence in him, they could call a vote and elect a new captain. This actually happened regularly. We have records of pirates voting out captains who were too cautious, too reckless, or simply unpopular. Second, equal shares of plunder. Most pirate codes specified that common crew members received one full share of all captured goods. The captain typically received 1.5 or 2 shares, not much more than everyone else. The quartermaster, who managed supplies and mediated disputes, usually got 1.25 shares. Skilled. Positions like the surgeon or gunner might get slightly more. Compare this to legitimate merchant ships, where captains might earn 50 times what a common sailor made, and you start to understand why piracy was attractive. A successful pirate cruise could earn a common crew member more than 5 years of merchant wages. Third, and most fascinating, disability compensation. Pirate codes included detailed schedules of payments for injuries sustained in battle. A typical code might specify loss of right arm, 600 pieces of 8, loss of left arm, 500, loss of right leg, 500, loss of left leg, 400, loss of an eye, 100, loss of a finger, 100. Think about what this means. In 1716, legitimate society offered zero support for disabled workers. If you lost a leg working on a merchant ship, you were simply cast ashore at the next port with nothing. But pirates created what was essentially the first workers' compensation system, guaranteeing financial security for injured crew members. The codes also covered discipline. Unlike the arbitrary brutality of legitimate ships, pirate codes specified exactly what offenses warranted what punishments. Stealing from the common fund meant marooning, being left on a deserted island with a pistol, some powder, and a bottle of water. Fighting aboard ship meant flogging or loss of shares. Deserting in battle meant death. But here's what's crucial. These punishments couldn't be imposed by the captain alone. Most codes required that accusations be heard by the entire crew, with the accused given a chance to defend themselves. Punishments were voted on. It was crude, but it was a form of due process that didn't exist in legitimate maritime service. Some codes even covered entertainment. One famous article from Bartholomew Roberts's ship stated that musicians were allowed to rest on Sundays, but only on Sundays. The rest of the week, any crew member could demand music, and the musicians had to comply. This might seem trivial, but it reveals how seriously pirates took the written rules governing their society. These codes were posted prominently aboard ship, and every man signed them or made his mark. They were binding contracts, and pirates took them seriously. Violating the articles meant punishment, no exceptions. If you're enjoying discovering this side of pirate history, drop a like to help the channel grow. It takes just a second and makes a real difference. Now, let's look at how this democracy actually functioned in daily life. So the pirates had their codes, their elections, their systems of justice. But how did all this work in practice? What was daily life actually like in Nassau between 1715 and 1718? First, understand that Nassau wasn't just a temporary camp. It was a functioning port city. The pirates rebuilt the ruins they'd found, constructing taverns, brothels, supply houses, and even a primitive marketplace. Ships arrived regularly, not just pirate vessels, but also traders willing to deal with outlaws. These merchants brought rum, weapons, cloth, and other supplies in exchange for the goods pirates had captured. The economy ran on plunder, obviously, but it was more organized than you might think. When a pirate crew returned from a successful raid, the division of spoils followed a specific process. First, the crew would vote on the value of captured goods. Then, after setting aside the ship's operating expenses and the compensation fund, for injured men, they'd divide everything according to the shares specified in their articles. This usually happened publicly, on the beach, with the entire crew watching to ensure fairness. The quartermaster oversaw the division, and his authority in these matters exceeded even the captain's. If a crew member felt cheated, he could appeal to the assembled company, and they'd vote on whether the quartermaster had acted correctly. Once the men had their shares, Nassau's economy kicked into gear. Pirates spent their money freely, on rum, women, gambling, and supplies for the next voyage. The taverns did booming business. So did the traders who sailed from Jamaica and the Carolinas with goods to sell. Money circulated rapidly, and for a few years Nassau was probably one of the most economically active ports in the Caribbean. But the Republic needed more than just an economy, it needed governance. Without some central authority, disputes between different crews could escalate into violence. So the pirates created an informal council of captains. This wasn't a permanent government. It had no fixed membership or regular meetings. But when important matters arose that affected the entire Republic, the major captains would gather to discuss them. Benjamin Hornigold, Henry Jennings, Charles Vane, and later Edward Thatch, who we know as Blackbeard, all participated in these councils at various times. The councils made decisions about common defense, about what to do with captured naval vessels, about whether to negotiate with colonial authorities. Again, decisions were made by vote, though only captains participated. It was representative democracy of a sort. Captains represented their crews, who had elected them. They also dealt with problems. When a drunk pirate murdered another in a tavern brawl, the council had to decide what to do. When two crews got into a dispute over a captured ship they'd both claimed, the council arbitrated. When word came that naval vessels were hunting pirates, the council coordinated defensive measures. This system was messy and informal, but it worked. For 3 years, over 1,000 heavily armed criminals managed to coexist without tearing themselves apart. That's actually remarkable. Daily life for an individual pirate varied depending on whether he was at sea or in port. At sea, life was governed by the ship's articles and the rhythms of sailing. Men worked in shifts, handling sails, standing watch, maintaining equipment. When a potential target appeared, the crew would vote on whether to attack. If they decided yes, they'd raise the black flag, a signal that meant surrender or die. Combat, when it happened, was usually brief. Most merchant ships surrendered rather than fight against pirates who outnumbered them and had nothing to lose. The pirates would board, take what they wanted, and either sink the merchant vessel or let it go. If the merchant crew had a reputation for treating sailors well, the pirates often let them go unharmed. If they were known as brutal taskmasters, the pirates might force them to join or exact some revenge. In port, life was different. Nassau had no formal laws beyond the ship articles that governed individual crews, but certain norms developed. Murder was generally frowned upon. It was bad for business and could trigger blood feuds. Theft within the community was similarly discouraged, but drinking, gambling, fighting, and carousing were expected and accepted. Women were present in Nassau, though in small numbers. Some were prostitutes who'd come to serve the growing population. Others were partners or wives of pirates. Yes, some pirates maintained relationships and even families. A few women actually sailed with pirate crews, though we'll talk more about that aspect later. The physical layout of Nassau reflected its chaotic nature. There was no central planning. Structures went up wherever someone decided to build. The fort, which had once been the seat of British colonial authority, was partially repaired by the pirates for defense, but mostly left in ruins. The best buildings were the taverns, which served as social centers, meeting halls, and sometimes temporary courtrooms when disputes needed resolution. Sanitation was terrible. Disease spread easily in the tropical heat. Many pirates died not from combat, but from fever, infection, or alcohol poisoning. The average life expectancy for a Nassau pirate was probably in the 20s or early 30s. But for men who'd grown up in the slums of London or served brutal apprenticeships at sea, this was still an improvement in terms of freedom and earnings, even if it wasn't necessarily longer. Religion was mostly absent. A few pirates maintained their faith, but most had abandoned it or had never had much to begin with. There were no churches in Nassau, no ministers, no formal religious observances. This was one of the things that horrified contemporary observers, a society that functioned without God or king. We're getting to the most interesting part of the story. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. There's new content here every week exploring the lesser-known corners of history. Let's continue with who these pirates actually were. The popular image of pirates is pretty uniform. Rough English or Irish sailors, rebels against authority, romantic rogues. But the reality of who lived in Nassau was far more diverse and complex than the myths suggest. Start with the English and European pirates, who did make up the majority. But even within this group, there was huge variation. Some were former privateers who'd simply continued their old work without government permission. Men like Henry Jennings had been respectable ship captains during the war. They had families, property, and reputations. They turned to piracy not because they were inherently criminal, but because peace had made their skills worthless in the legitimate economy. Others came from the merchant service. These were men who'd endured years of brutal treatment, low pay, and arbitrary punishment. For them, piracy wasn't just about money. It was about escaping a system that treated them as disposable. When they joined pirate crews, they were choosing democracy over dictatorship, even if that democracy was violent and illegal. Then there were the truly desperate, debtors fleeing prison, criminals escaping punishment, men with nothing left to lose. These formed the hardcore faction of Nassau's population, the ones who saw themselves as permanent outlaws with no hope of returning to legitimate society. But Nassau also attracted people who had even fewer options in the colonial world. Escaped slaves made up a significant portion of many pirate crews. Historians estimate that perhaps 15 to 20% of pirates in this period were of African descent. Many of them escaped slaves from Caribbean plantations. For these men, piracy offered something almost unimaginable in the 18th century, the possibility of equality. On a pirate ship operating under signed articles, a black crew member had the same vote as a white one. He received the same share of plunder. He could rise to positions of authority based on skill rather than birth. We have records of black pirates serving as quartermasters, gunners, and even captains. This wasn't universal. Some pirate crews were as racist as the societies they'd left behind, but many genuinely practiced a form of racial equality that wouldn't become common for another 200 years. The articles made no distinction based on color. One share was one share, one vote was one vote. The same applied to some extent for escaped indentured servants, debtors, and other marginalized groups. The pirate republic became a refuge for people with nowhere else to go. If you could pull a line, fire a gun, or swing a sword, you were valuable. Your background mattered less than your willingness to contribute. Native outlaws. Americans also appear in the records, though less frequently. Some had been displaced by colonial expansion. Others had worked as sailors or pilots and found pirate crews more welcoming than colonial society. Mixed-race individuals, who faced discrimination in both European and native communities, sometimes found acceptance among pirates. The age range was broad. Most pirates were young men in their 20s and 30s, but crews included teenagers and men in their 50s. Boy sailors, some as young as 12 or 13, worked as powder monkeys during battles or apprenticed in skilled positions. Older men who'd spent decades at sea shared their expertise with younger crew members. What motivated all these diverse people to choose piracy? The reasons varied, but several themes emerged from the historical record. Money was obviously a major factor. A successful pirate could earn more in one cruise than a merchant sailor made in 5 years. For someone from poverty, that kind of money represented life-changing opportunity. Even if the pirate life was dangerous, it offered a chance at real wealth, not just survival wages. But freedom mattered just as much as money for many. The ability to vote on decisions, to have a say in your own fate, to not live under the thumb of an arbitrary authority. These were powerful draws. Remember, these men came from a world where democracy didn't exist for common people. Voting was restricted to property-owning men, and even in elected governments, common sailors and workers had no voice. On a pirate ship, your voice mattered. You could speak at crew meetings. You could vote against the captain. You could propose new articles or challenge unfair treatment. For someone who'd been beaten and silenced their entire life, this was revolutionary. Revenge also motivated some. Men who'd been brutalized by merchant captains or naval officers sometimes turned to piracy specifically to strike back at the system that had harmed them. When pirates captured a merchant vessel, they would often ask the crew about their captain. If the sailors reported that he was fair and decent, the pirates would let him go unharmed. But if they said he was a tyrant, the pirates might punish him, sometimes severely. There are accounts of pirates forcing abusive captains to run the gauntlet, making them walk between two lines of sailors who beat them with ropes. Others were simply executed. This wasn't just random violence. It was a form of rough justice, a way of punishing the oppressors who operated with impunity in the legitimate world. For escaped slaves, the motivation was even more fundamental: survival and freedom. Returning to plantation life meant torture and death. Piracy offered a chance to stay free, to earn money, and to be treated as an equal. The risk of hanging was worth it compared to the certainty of slavery. Some historians argue that piracy represented a genuine form of class rebellion, a rejection of the emerging capitalist system that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of ship owners and merchants while treating sailors as expendable resources. The pirates' democratic articles, their equal distribution of wealth, and their attacks on merchant shipping can be seen as political statements, not just criminal acts. Whether the pirates themselves saw it that way is debatable. Most probably thought in simpler terms. They wanted money, freedom, and revenge. But intentional or not, they created a society that challenged the fundamental hierarchies of their world. By 1717, however, that society was becoming unstable. Internal tensions were rising, and external threats were mounting. The final chapter of the Republic was beginning. The beginning of the end came in December 1717, when word reached Nassau that King George III had issued a royal proclamation. Any pirate who surrendered to British authorities before January 5, 1718, would receive a full pardon for all previous crimes. After that date, the offer would expire and the Navy would hunt down all remaining pirates without mercy. The proclamation split Nassau's population. For the first time, the Republic's fragile unity began to crack. On one side were the pragmatists, led by men like Benjamin Hornigold and Henry Jennings. These were the former privateers, the older men who'd seen piracy as a temporary solution to peacetime unemployment. They had skills they could use in legitimate commerce. Some had families they wanted to return to. The pardon offered them a way out, a chance to invest their plunder in legal businesses and retire as respectable citizens. They argued at the council meetings that the Republic couldn't last forever. The British had tolerated Nassau because dealing with it required resources they'd been unwilling to commit. But that was changing. Naval power was being redirected to the Caribbean. A new governor had been appointed specifically to crush the pirate haven. Taking the pardon now, while it was offered, was the smart move. On the other side were the hardcore outlaws, led by Charles Vane and supported by younger, more radical pirates. These men rejected the pardon categorically. Some had no skills beyond violence. Others had committed crimes too serious to risk trusting British mercy. They feared that even with pardons, they'd be arrested for specific murders or raids, and many simply refused on principle to submit to any authority. Vane argued that Nassau should be fortified and defended. The Republic had over 1,000 armed men. They had ships, cannons, and a defensible harbor. They could force the British to negotiate on equal terms, or at least make any attack so costly that the Crown would give up. This faction saw themselves as rebels, not just criminals. They hated the system that had created poverty, inequality, and oppression. They'd built something different in Nassau. Messy and violent, yes, but also free and equal in ways legitimate society wasn't. Surrendering meant returning to a world where men like them had no voice and no power. The debate raged through January 1718. Council meetings grew heated. Fights broke out in taverns between supporters of the two factions. Some crews split apart as members took different sides. The pragmatists had one major advantage. The machinery of pirate democracy supported them. When it came to a vote in the full council, the majority of captains sided with accepting the pardon. But the radicals controlled the fort and could physically prevent anyone from surrendering. In early February, Vane led a group of armed men to Fort Nassau. They tore down the British flag that Hornigold's faction had raised and hoisted a black flag in its place. For several weeks, the two factions existed in an armed standoff. Ships loyal to Hornigold and Jennings anchored in one part of the harbor. Vane's ships controlled the fort and the other section. The situation became absurd at times. Pirates who'd been shipmates for years now avoided each other in the streets. Tavern owners had to carefully manage which factions drank in their establishments when. Some tried to stay neutral, but neutrality was becoming impossible. During this period, many pirates simply left. They took their shares, loaded their personal possessions, and sailed away to try their luck elsewhere. Some went to the Indian Ocean, where piracy was still relatively safe. Others scattered to small islands throughout the Caribbean, hoping to continue raiding on a smaller scale. The population of Nassau, which had peaked at well over 1,000, began to decline. Then, in July 1718, Woodes Rogers arrived. The new governor came with a small fleet of warships and several hundred soldiers. His instructions were clear: offer the pardon to any who would take it and destroy any who wouldn't. Vane made one last dramatic gesture. As Rogers's fleet entered the harbor, Vane set one of his own ships ablaze and sent it sailing toward the British vessels as a fire ship. It was meant to scatter the fleet and buy time for his remaining ships to escape. The fire ship narrowly missed, but it did create enough confusion for Vane and his most loyal followers to break through the blockade and escape. With Vane gone, resistance collapsed. Rogers landed unopposed. Hundreds of pirates lined up to receive their pardons, including Henry Jennings and Benjamin Hornigold. The Republic of Pirates was over. Looking back, it's easy to see the Republic as doomed from the start. A society of criminals couldn't last in a world of empires and navies. The experiment was always going to be temporary. But temporary doesn't mean meaningless. For 3 years, over 1,000 men lived under a system that was remarkably democratic and egalitarian by the standards of its time. They created written constitutions that guaranteed rights and due process. They elected their leaders and could remove them. They distributed wealth far more equally than any legitimate society of the period. They offered opportunities to escaped slaves and other marginalized people that wouldn't be available in the mainstream world for centuries. The pirate codes influenced later developments in maritime labor. Sailors in the 19th century would fight for and eventually win many of the same rights pirates had claimed for themselves: better pay, limits on arbitrary punishment, compensation for injuries, and eventually the right to form unions and bargain collectively. The radical equality practiced by some pirate crews foreshadowed later movements for racial justice. The idea that a person's value should be judged by their contribution rather than their birth or color was revolutionary in 1716. That it happened among criminals rather than philosophers doesn't make it less significant. And the democratic structures, however crude, demonstrated that common people could govern themselves without kings or aristocrats. This was in an era when monarchy was considered the natural order, when the idea of universal suffrage was dismissed as insane. The pirates proved that ordinary sailors could create functional, if imperfect, self-governance. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize too much. The Republic was built on violence and theft. The pirates attacked innocent merchant sailors, many of whom were just as poor and oppressed as the pirates themselves. People died in raids, in fights, in the harsh conditions of Nassau. The democracy was limited. Women had no voice, and decision-making was often chaotic and mob-driven. But within its limitations, the Pirate Republic represented something genuinely unusual. It was a space where the normal rules were suspended, where men at the bottom of society's hierarchy could briefly experience power and equality. That they chose to organize that space democratically rather than simply replacing one hierarchy with another tells us something important about what people want when they're free to choose. The Republic fell, but its legends grew. Within a few years, books about the pirates became bestsellers in Europe. The stories were exaggerated and romanticized, but they captured something real: the appeal of a life outside normal constraints, where capability mattered more than birth, and where freedom was worth fighting for even if it meant risking everything. And that was the story of the Pirate Republic, 3 years when democracy flourished among outlaws in Nassau. If you made it this far, thank you, seriously. These deep dives into overlooked corners of history take real work, and knowing people watch to the end makes it worthwhile. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel. Every week there's a new video exploring the stories that textbooks skip over. In the next video, I'll be covering the women who defied every expectation and became pirates themselves, the incredible true stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Leave a comment. Did you know about the democratic side of pirate society? What other historical topics would you like to see covered here? Until next time.